This is part of a series of talks on the biomechanics of the foot and ankle. And I'm going to start here with what I term the secrets of foot and ankle biomechanics, because these are the basic things which you need to understand for any of the rest of the talks to make sense. So what I'm going to talk to you about here are really few key things, and I'm going to start off with what I call 4 secrets, because these are things which you need to really understand and digest and use as a framework for considering everything else. So, what are these 4 secrets? Well, the first one is form reflects function. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, it means that everything is the way it is because that's the way it needs to be to fulfill its function. And that sounds obvious, but it's really key to understand that. Foot is a certain way because it's full of really clever energy-saving techniques, which will come on later on. The functional units, which we're going to talk about, work together in harmony to achieve efficiency of gait, which is again really what the foot and ankle is about. Well, what are the other secrets? Well, again, this sounds obvious, but the body moves around the foot. Most patients don't come in complaining that when I wave my foot in the air, I have problems. They complain that when I walk, I have problems. And traditionally, we are taught about the movements of the foot as studied and described by an anatomist, a very qualified anatomist, but it's studied and described by an anatomist on a cadaver which is non-weight bearing. However, our patients function during weight bearing, and therefore their foot is planted and the body's moving around it. And so that's really important. The third thing is that the foot functions in weight bearing. And again, that's important because, for example, taking the flat foot, you may learn about it as the talus is there and the hind foot moves into valgus, or in the cavus foot, the talus is here and the hind foot moves into varus. But what may actually be happening is that the hind foot remains planted and the rest of the foot remains planted, and the talus drops off one way or the other because the rest of the body weight is on it. And when you start thinking about the static and dynamic restraining structures in that sense, it actually deepens your understanding of biomechanics, and it actually makes a lot more sense, which we'll talk about in some of the future talks. And the last secret is the cake is a lie, and there are many ways to slice it. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So what we need to consider is the form, so that's the anatomy, the cake, which is the functional units of the foot and ankle, some of which you may be familiar with and some of which you may not, and the relative positions of these bones and units when weight bearing. And ultimately, you can tie that all in to figure out what's happening to the foot and ankle and the body during gait. But before we go on, just to recap and make sure everyone's clear, terms you need to know. Foot and ankle is often described in composite movements, and that is pronation and supination. But these are movements which occur around 3 planes simultaneously. So that's the axial plane, the coronal plane, and sagittal plane. And these are variably termed adduction, abduction, inversion, eversion, dorsiflexion, plantarflexion. And pronation is a composite movement of dorsiflexion at the ankle, eversion of the foot, hind foot, and abduction at the midfoot. So it's an upward and outward movement. And supination is the reverse. So you get plantarflexion at the ankle, inversion at the hind foot, and adduction towards the midline at the midfoot. So inwards and downwards. So moving on then, the cake is a lie. So this is a cake, and these are many ways to slice it to consider the different planes of the foot. And these are the sagittal, coronal, and the axial. So we'll start with the coronal, which is the one which people are probably most familiar with, but which also is probably one of the least useful. So this is a largely anatomic classification which divides the foot up into the forefoot, midfoot, and hindfoot. And the Lisfranc joints delineate the midfoot from the forefoot, and the Chopard joints the hindfoot from the midfoot. But apart from being useful for anatomy, they don't really give us much information on how to understand particular pathologies or indeed how to treat them. They may in some cases, but not as useful as the rest. So what are the others? Well, you may have heard of this one in the sagittal plane, and that's the medial column and the lateral column. And the medial column is the talus, the navicular, the cuneiforms, and the first three rays. And the lateral column is the calcaneus, the cuboid, and the lateral rays. And this is really important to understand because the medial column is rigid and is supposed to be rigid, and the lateral column is supposed to be flexible. So take the analogy of the hand, for example. You need a medial column which is rigid to pinch and pick up stuff, and you need a flexible column in order to grip. And the foot's not that different. You need a rigid medial column because when you toe off, you put your weight on your big toe and you push off, and you need that to be able to withstand the load of your body weight and transfer the load so that you can have an effective propulsion. However, the lateral column needs to be flexible to accommodate to the ground, because when you walk and when you heel strike, and then you go on the lateral side of your foot, and that needs to be flexible in order to find its way on the ground, accommodate, shock absorb, and then you transfer your load on the medial side, and then you push off. And that's really important. And the reason it's important clinically is because if you are going to fuse anything because of arthritis, you'd fuse stuff on the medial side, but not the lateral side for that reason. So what about the last plane? Well, we said it's the axial plane, and that is called the calcaneopedal unit. So not everyone's heard of this, but you take the talus, the tibia, and the fibula as one unit. So that's the tibio-tibial-fibular unit, and the calcaneopedal unit's everything else. And the way you can think about this is that the talus and everything above it with the body is trying to push itself onto the floor, and the rest of the foot is trying to cup itself underneath and hold itself in place to balance. And the way it does that, it sheathes the talus with bony architecture from the navicular, the calcaneum, but also things like the spring ligament and everything on the medial side, the medial structures to hold things in place. And if any of those fail, the calcaneopedal unit will be more mobile, and the talus can actually fall off the rest of the foot, which you may see in a flat foot. And that's something we'll come to in later talks as well. So there are only a couple of other things to talk about here in this short introduction, and that is it's really important to understand that the foot tries to be flat to the floor and balanced. And you can consider the foot as a tripod, where one leg of the tripod is the heel, and one is the fifth metatarsal, and one is the first metatarsal. And if you actually take a tripod like so, and if that's the heel and those are the metatarsals, you'll see that if they're all lined up, they're balanced. However, looking at the heel over here, if you were to, for example, raise one metatarsal off the ground for whatever reason, the whole thing tips because it has to, because the foot has to be flat to the floor. But that leaves the hindfoot in a bad position and upsets the calcaneopedal unit. So the goal of any treatment is really to make the foot flat to the floor and balanced, with the heel underneath the body and aligning the metatarsals. So you're treating both the forefoot and the hindfoot. And if you can achieve that, then that's a very good understanding and a basis for the biomechanics of the foot and ankle. And it'll serve you well for the rest of the talks and indeed your practice. Thank you.